Assalamu alaikum. God's peace be with you all. My name is Reza Mansour. I'm the Vice Chair of the Board of the Hartford Seminary, and today I am your moderator. And on behalf of the Hartford Seminary, I would like to welcome you warmly on this cold winter day to our expert panel on ISIS. I would like to thank Susan Schoenberger for organizing this event and the distinguished professors for being willing to participate in this panel, and all of you for coming out and listening to us today. As a member of the Muslim community, to hear the word Islam, which means submission to the will of God, and comes from the root word salam or peace, be associated with such brutal violence by this group, calling itself the Islamic State, is quite abhorrent to almost all followers of Islam. For the layperson listening to sensational media and the confusion created by so-called liberals, such as Bill Maher attributing blame to Islam, is particularly concerning. It is therefore vital that we have a thorough and enlightening discussion of the many aspects of the creation of IS or ISIS and how we have come to the sad situation we are in. We will have 10 minutes for each of the panelists, followed by questions and answers from the audience. Please try to make your questions short without too much commentary so that others can also have the opportunity to ask questions. Let me begin by calling up our distinguished panelists. Professor Mahmoud Ayub will start. Do you all want to come up to the platform here? Professor Mahmoud Ayub will start the panel, followed by Professor Ferial Salim, followed by Professor Najib Awad, and then Professor Timur Yuskayev. So let me begin by introducing Professor Mahmoud Ayub. He is a faculty associate in Islam and Christian-Muslim relations. Professor Ayub's authority in both the scholarship and comparative study of Islam and Muslim-Christian relations, as well as interreligious dialogue, is demonstrated by the national and international recognition he has received. Since 1999, Dr. Ayub has participated in the US Department of State's program, serving as one of its ambassadors to various parts of the Middle East and Southeast Asia, commenting on American society, its institutions, interreligious dialogue, and Islam in America. Professor Ayub.
Good evening and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Among the religions of the world, I believe Islam to be unique in that from the beginning it was founded as a religion and a state, deen wa dawla. And Islam ideally should be a balance in this equilibrium of authority in the spiritual and theological realm and temporal authority. In Mecca, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, laid the foundations for a state which took place in Medina, and therefore one of the most important events, central events in Muslim history, is the Prophet's migration from Mecca to Medina, where he added to his leadership as Prophet a political leadership. And this is reflected in what we call the pillars of Islam. I don't have the time to go through them, but among the pillars is the pillar of zakat, and it's usually mentioned immediately after the prayers. And zakat is a purification tax that a person gives annually for the help of the poor in society. This emphasis on this world and the world to come is most beautifully, in my view, reflected in the well-known Quranic verse which says, "Seek by what God has bestowed upon you the abode of the hereafter, but do not forget your portion of this world. Do good as God has been good to you." This is the idea. Now, when there was a division which happened quite early in Islam, understandably, it was precisely on this equilibrium between religious authority and temporal authority. This is what divided the community into Sunni and Shia communities, but within the worldwide Muslim Ummah that includes all those who say, "I bear witness that God alone is God and that Muhammad is the messenger of God." Dr. Mansour, tell me when my time is nearly up. Yeah. Now, the problem, as in all really other religions with Islam, is that some people wanted to see Islam simply as a state, and they reduced religion to a state function. So they were completely bound by Islamic law. And these were actually represented in early Islam by a group that are called Khawarij, the Kharijites, the seceders, who left Ali's camp. Ali was the fourth of the rightly guided caliphs. They left his camp and formed their own leadership, their own imara, as we would call it, that is leadership of the community. And they killed everyone who did not agree with them. There are many prophetic traditions speaking against this approach. One illustrates my point. The Prophet said to one of his companions, Abu Dhar, "O Abu Dhar, anyone who says La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God, will enter paradise." Abu Dhar said, "Even if he commits adultery?" Yes, the Prophet said, "Even if he commits adultery." "Even if he steals?" Yes, even if he steals. And so on. And then the Prophet said, in spite of Abu Dhar's disagreement. So what this and many other hadiths from the Prophet were telling us all is that people must always take the middle road. As the Quran also says, "We have made you a community of the middle way in order that you may be witnesses over humankind." The Khawarij lasted for some time and eventually they disappeared. But by that time, actually the caliphate itself was largely reduced to a temporal authority, and the religious authority was subordinated to the temporal authority instead of being in equilibrium as the ideal of Islam is. And since the 8th century, we had a number of groups that started as a reform movement and eventually took a very harsh approach in society that was in the end condemned by the religious authorities of that time. And so, in my view, the movement of ISIS is not unique, nor is it actually outside the realm of Islam. But it is based on an interpretation which actually goes against the principles of Islam. And let me illustrate this. God says, Call to the way of your Lord with wisdom and good counsel, and dispute with them, that is the people of the book, in the fairest manner, rather than what ISIS are doing, killing anybody, including the Muslims who disagreed with them. And in another verse, God tells us in the Quran, do not dispute with the people of the book except in the fairest manner, and say to them, we believe in that which God has sent down for you and that which He has sent down for us. Our God and your God is one, and to Him we are submitters, Muslims. Actually, on the ground in history, the Muslims in a way made a division of the world which is often misrepresented. The division was Dar al-Islam, the abode of Islam, and this came to be any place where Muslims either were in a majority or had the freedom to worship God without oppression or hindrance. On the other extreme, there is the Dar al-Harb, the abode of war, and that is the place where Muslims felt insecure and they need to find security for themselves. But then there was the abode of mutuality and the abode of peace, between the Muslims and non-Muslims. It's very important to observe here that Islam began as a community of believers, according to Fred Donner of the University of Chicago, where Muslims and Christians and often Jews also prayed in one prayer house. In fact, the Quran itself said, had God not protected some people by means of others, many churches, monasteries, synagogues, and mosques in which God's name is mentioned would be destroyed. And so the houses of God, as described in the Quran, are not limited to the mosque. They are the mosques, the churches, the monasteries, and the synagogues. And as the Muslim state grew larger, they came even to include Hindu temples, even though they may have idols. Now, the Muslims built relations under the Umayyads and the Abbasids when Islam really emerged as a separate identity, and that would take too long to go into details. Islamic law began to develop into the legal schools that we have today. Things had to be legalized, and rewards and punishments and so on had to be also taken into account. But in all this, there was the hadith which said from the Prophet, protect yourself from major punishments with uncertainties. That is to say, nobody should be punished either as capital punishment or any kind of punishment unless it is very clear that that person needs to be punished. Again, we compare this with what ISIS is doing, and certainly what they are doing is against Islamic law and against the spirit of Islam, which is based on the middle way, the means between two extremes. Now, ISIS began in 1999 by a rather conservative Jordanian Salafi, Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, who eventually was killed, and it continued to develop further in 2003, 2006, and we are where we are today. Now, the rest of this story I will not go into because then we are in the media. And today, this afternoon actually, I heard on NPR a very well informed description of what ISIS is doing today. Our really purpose in getting together here this evening is to share ideas, to inform you that what the ISIS movement is doing is not actually Islamic, although they themselves are convinced that they are doing the right thing and in the name of Islam. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ayub. So we're going to have all the speakers first, and then after that we'll have the questions and answers. Just for the panelists, if you can just make sure that the mic is close to your mouth when you speak. Our second speaker is Professor Farid Al-Salam, Assistant Professor of Islamic Scripture and Law, Co-Director of the Islamic Chaplaincy Program, and Director of the Imam and Muslim Community Leadership Programs. Her research and specialization is on early Islamic thought with an emphasis on the foundations of Islamic scripture, hadith methodology, and hermeneutics in classical Islamic texts. Dr. Salam.
Thank you. My focus will be to look at the way Muslim scholars have disputed both the religious validity of virtually all of the practices of ISIS, as well as objecting to its claim of being a caliphate or Islamic state. This has taken the form of an important letter written to Baghdadi. It's known as the Open Letter to Baghdadi. You can look this up online and read the full letter. Based on this understanding, the Muslim scholars have argued that ISIS is neither Islamic nor a state. They've also argued that if you do not defeat these ideas intellectually, that they will reemerge. And so they've put together a letter that's about 16 pages long that I'm going to paraphrase parts of and quote parts of, and I think that this is really helpful to look at the Islamic perspective on these events, as argued by many scholars globally who signed this letter. So this was a letter signed by approximately 150 scholars, Muslim scholars globally, and they begin this letter by emphasizing the importance of having a grounding in Islamic knowledge and scripture and law before making any statements claiming that such an act or such a practice is or is not Islamic. The first thing they mention is that it is not permissible to quote a verse or part of a verse without thoroughly considering and comprehending everything that the Quran and Hadith relate about that point. This is what Imam Shafi'i explains in his Risala, as well as Imam al-Haramain Juwayni, and I'm quoting from the letter. Regarding the qualities of a mufti and the disciplines that he must master, it is imperative that the mufti must be a scholar of language, for the Sharia is in Arabic. It is imperative that he be a scholar of syntax and parting. It is imperative that he be a scholar of Quran, for the Quran is the basis of all rulings. Knowledge of textual abrogation is indispensable, and the science of the fundamentals of jurisprudence is the cornerstone of the whole subject. He should also know the various degrees of proofs and arguments as well as their histories, the science of hadith so that he can distinguish between the authentic from the weak, the acceptable from the apocryphal. He should also know jurisprudence. Moreover, having legal intuition is needed. It is the capital of anyone who derives legal rulings. Scholars have summarized all of this by saying that a mufti is someone who independently knows all the texts and arguments for legal rulings. Text refers to mastering language, Quranic exegesis, hadith, while arguments indicates mastering legal theory, analogical reasoning of the various kinds, as well as legal intuition. The letter also emphasizes the importance of allowing for differences of opinion, and this has been the basis of Islamic scholarship for 1400 years, and that you find that there are many, many issues in which there are a variety of opinions, and that preferring the easier opinion or the opinion that is more open to the community that one is a part of has also been a principle used by scholars. The letter also emphasizes the importance of context in deriving Islamic law. So this is known as fiqh al-waqi', or practical jurisprudence. And what is meant by practical jurisprudence is the process of applying Sharia rulings and dealing with them according to the realities and circumstances that people are living under. This is achieved by having an insight into the realities under which people are living and identifying their problems, struggles, capabilities, and what they are subject to. Practical jurisprudence, or fiqh al-waqi', considers the texts that are applicable to people's realities at a particular time and the obligations that can be postponed until they are able to be met or delayed based on their capabilities. Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya says, indeed, a jurist must understand people's circumstances, customs, and traditions. Religious edicts change with the change of time, place, customs, and circumstances, and all of this is from religion of God. The killing of innocent people and any human being, regardless of faith, is also strictly forbidden in Islam. And this is discussed at length. There's 2 verses in particular that are cited. And do not slay the soul whose life God has made inviolable. This is in Isra, chapter 17:33. Also, because of that, we decreed for the children of Israel that whoever slays a soul for other than a soul or for corruption in the land, it shall be as though he had slain all of humanity. And whoever saves the life of one, it shall be as if he had saved the life of all of humanity. Similarly, of killing of emissaries or ambassadors, this is another part of the practices that ISIS has done. The letter states, it is known that all religions forbid the killing of emissaries. What is meant by emissaries here are people who are sent from a group of people to another to perform a noble task, such as reconciliation or the delivery of a message. Emissaries have special inviolability. Ibn Mas'ud said, the Sunnah, or the prophetic precedent, continues that emissaries are never killed. Journalists are emissaries of truth because their job is to expose the truth to people in general. You have mercilessly killed the journalists James Foley and Stephen Sotloff, even after Sotloff's mother pleaded with you and begged for mercy. And the list has grown since this letter was written. Aid workers are also emissaries of mercy and kindness. Yet you killed the aid worker David Haynes. What you have done is unquestionably forbidden in Islam or haram. As far as martial engagements or warfare, what is jihad, which is the lesser jihad, the letter goes into a lot of detail on that, which I will not go into. But there are some important rules of conduct if war is undertaken in self-defense that is delineated here. The rules of conduct of jihad are summarized in the words of the Prophet Muhammad: do not be treacherous, do not mutilate or kill. The Prophet also said on the day of conquest, those retreating are not to be killed, nor are the injured to be harmed, and whoever shuts his door is safe. Similarly, when Abu Bakr as-Siddiq prepared an army and sent it to the Levant, he said, you will find people who have devoted themselves to monasteries, leave them to their devotions. Do not kill the old, the decrepit, women or children. Do not destroy buildings. Do not cut down trees or harm livestock without good. Do not burn or drown homes. Do not be treacherous. Do not mutilate. Do not be cowardly, and do not loot. Okay, so we've seen clearly that the events in Syria and Iraq do not portray any of the guidelines of warfare when warfare is allowed. Also, in terms of people of the scripture, the letter says, regarding Arab Christians, you gave them 3 choices: jizya, the poll tax, the sword, or conversion to Islam. You painted their homes red, you destroyed their churches, and in some cases looted their homes and property. You killed some of them and caused many others to flee their homes, with nothing but their lives and the clothes on their backs. These Christians are not combatants against Islam or transgressors against it. Indeed, they are friends, neighbors, and co-citizens. From the legal perspective of Sharia, they fall under ancient agreements that are around 1400 years old, and the rulings of jihad do not apply to them. Some of their ancestors fought alongside the Prophet's army against the Byzantines, and thus have been citizens of the state of Medina since that time. Others are under agreements that were guaranteed to them by Umar ibn al-Khattab, Khalid ibn al-Walid, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Ottomans, and their respective states. In short, they are not strangers to these lands, but rather of the native peoples of these lands from pre-Islamic times. They are not enemies, but friends. For the past 1400 years, they have defended their countries against the Crusades, colonialists, Israel, and other wars. How then can you treat them as enemies? The Quran says, God does not forbid you in regard to those who did not wage war against you on account of religion and did not expel you from your homes, that you should treat them kindly and deal with them justly. Assuredly, God loves the just. As for the Yazidis, you fought the Yazidis under the banner of jihad, but they neither fought you nor Muslims. You considered them Satanists and gave them the choice of either to be killed or be forced into Islam. You killed hundreds of them and buried them in mass graves. You caused the death and suffering of hundreds of others. Had it not been for the American and Kurdish intervention, tens of thousands of their men, women, children, and elderly would have been killed. These are all abominable crimes from the legal perspective of Sharia. They are Magians because the Prophet said in a hadith, treat them as you treat the people of the scripture. Thus, they are people of the scripture. The Quran says, truly those who believe from Jews, Sabians, and Christians, and Magians, and the polytheists, God will indeed judge between them on the day of resurrection. Assuredly, God over all things is a witness. Even if you doubt that they are people of the scripture from a legal perspective of Sharia, many scholars of the pious forebears considered them to be commensurate with Magians based on the aforementioned hadith. The Umayyads even considered Hindus and Buddhists to be protected people. Al-Qurtubi said, Al-Awza'i said, jizya is to be levied on those who worship idols and fire as well as unbelievers and agnostics. This is also the opinion of the Maliki position, for Imam Malik's opinion was that jizya is levied on all idol worshippers and unbelievers. Coercion and compulsion. The Quran says you are not a taskmaster over them. There is no compulsion in religion. Rectitude has become clear. And if your Lord willed, all who are on the earth would have believed together. Would you then compel them until they are believers? And the truth from your Lord, so whoever will, let him believe, and whoever will, let him disbelieve. And in another verse, you have your religion and I have mine. It is known that the verse, there is no compulsion in religion, was revealed after the conquest of Mecca. Hence, no one can claim that it was abrogated. They have coerced people to convert to Islam, just as you have coerced Muslims to accept your views. You also coerce everyone living under your control in every matter, great or small, even in matters which are between the individual and God. And there are various incidents here that are given, and this has no precedent in Islamic law before this. Is my time up? Yeah. Okay. So essentially, this is a letter that engages all of the ideas and the claims that they make in terms of using Islam to justify their actions. It engages each one of these individually. And I just want to read the last section on the caliphate, which I think is important. On the caliphate, the letter mentions, there is agreement among scholars that a caliphate is an obligation on the Ummah. However, a new caliphate requires consensus from Muslims and not just from those in some small corner of the world. Umar ibn al-Khattab said, "Whosoever pledges allegiance to a man without due consultation with Muslims has fooled himself, and neither he nor the man to whom he pledged allegiance should be followed, for he has risked both their lives." Announcing a caliphate without consensus is sedition, because it renders the majority of Muslims who do not approve it outside of the caliphate. It will also lead to many rival caliphates emerging, thereby sowing sedition and discord among Muslims. The beginnings of this discord reared its head when the Sunni Imams of Mosul did not pledge allegiance and they were killed. In the speech of Baghdadi, he quoted the companion of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, "I have been given authority over you and I am not the best of you." The letter goes on to say, this begs the question, who gave you authority over the Ummah? Was it your group? If this is the case, then a group of no more than several thousand has appointed itself the ruler over 1.5 billion Muslims. This attitude is based on a corrupt circular logic that says only we are Muslims and we decide who the caliph is. We have chosen one, and so whoever does not accept our caliph is not a Muslim. In this case, a caliph is nothing more than the leader of a certain group that declares more than 99% of Muslims as non-Muslim. On the other hand, if you recognize the 1.5 billion people who consider themselves Muslim, how can you not consult them regarding your so-called caliphate? Thus you face one of two conclusions. Either you concur that they are Muslims and they did not appoint you as caliph over them, in which case you are not the caliph, or the other conclusion is that you do not accept them as Muslims, in which case Muslims are a small group not in need of a caliph. So why use the word caliph at all? In truth, the caliphate must emerge from a consensus of Muslim countries, organizations of Islamic scholars, and Muslims from across the globe. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Salman. Our third panelist is Professor Najib Awad, Associate Professor of Christian Theology. He's a native of Syria. He grew up in the country's majority Muslim, yet also multi-religious and multi-ethnic context. He has been involved recently in international efforts to find solutions to the ongoing conflict in Syria. Professor Awad.
Thank you very much. My colleagues Mahmoud and Faryal have already gave you, I think, a very sufficient description of the Islamic theological and jurisprudential background of ISIS, and by the nature of their academic specialty, they're much more qualified than me in doing that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you into yet another dimension. I'm going to invite you to listen to some observations and reflections on the situation of ISIS on the ground. What is ISIS and what ISIS does on the ground, specifically in Syria? I can share that with you sufficiently simply because, not just because Syria is my country and I'm deeply concerned about what's happening there, and I dedicate a substantial portion of my time following up what's happening, but also because I'm an intellectual activist in the Syrian revolution. So I collect my information as much as I can, as best as I can, from Syrian activists who are still working inside the country or who survived that inferno and they try to help the country from abroad, or from some of the Syrian activists who are involved in some of the opposition parties, and I meet them in conferences and we talk about the situation. I would like to share with you in the remaining 9 minutes of my contribution 2 points. The first one is I do realize that in the media and sort of the public opinion in the West, there is a speech about ISIS as if it is one body, one phenomenon in Syria and Iraq. I think this is not quite accurate. We should definitely look at ISIS as actually two situations related to two different countries. So the story of ISIS in Iraq is one thing. The story of ISIS in Syria is another. And if we don't depart from that observation, we may fall into some, allow myself to say some mistakes. Now, as my colleague Mahmoud said, ISIS in Iraq started in 1999 by Mus'ab al-Zarqawi. And it was actually sentimentally welcomed by the Sunnite people in Iraq because, first, it was looked at as an army against the foreign invader, i.e. America, and second, because it was looked at as a Sunnite voice against the gradually prevailing Shiite voice in Iraq. The Shiite voice started to take over the decision-making circles, and that's why ISIS was sentimentally supported as a cause by some Sunnite tribes in parts of Iraq. In Syria, ISIS started about 2 years ago, and our information say it started when al-Maliki opened the prisons in Iraq and released certain jihadi, fanaticist fighters who were close to al-Zarqawi, one of which is al-Baghdadi. And later on, this led eventually into the creation of an ISIS in Syria. So in terms of origin, we have two stories. But also in terms of membership, we have two stories. In Iraq, ISIS, the majority of fighters of ISIS in Iraq are either Iraqis or Arabs. The minority are foreigners. In Syria, it's the other way around. The majority are foreigners. The majority are Arabs, Muslim Arabs, or Muslims from all over the world, and the minority are Syrians. Now that's another important factor to keep in mind when we want to analyze the situation. In Syria, ISIS has not started making a threat just a few months ago when they slaughtered the American journalist and they published this online. This was the point when, as an observer, I realized the American public started to pay attention to ISIS. But ISIS was actually committing mass massacres in Syria against Syrian civilians from all backgrounds, by the way, in Syrian cities like northern Syria or in eastern Syria. They occupied cities and they started massacring people there in dozens and in hundreds. And the majority of those who were massacred were actually Sunnites. This is another fact. Now, we have to keep in mind that some of the very few Syrian public sentimentally supported ISIS because while ISIS was persecuting those Syrians, the Syrian regime was also simultaneously bombarding Syrian cities and was destroying these cities without touching any ISIS fighter, without fighting against ISIS itself. So those Syrian civilians were being bombarded systematically, radically, daily by the regime's ferocious death arsenal. And the world was not paying attention to that at all. On the ground, ISIS would come to some villages and cities and tell the people, give them these three choices, which my colleague Ferial just mentioned. In other words, it will tell them, I give you the choice to stay alive. The regime would never give any choice. The regime would come and destroy and turn level cities to the ground. So for people who are in the midst of the fire, existentially speaking, they would sentimentally find a justification for ISIS because those ferocious criminals are giving them a choice to stay alive. So, if we want to read ISIS' influence on the scene in Syria without taking into consideration what the regime, Al-Assad regime, is doing and committing, we will not be reading the Syrian scene correctly. And Al-Assad regime is actually capitalizing on the existence of ISIS by prolonging its staying in rule. Because it says now to the world, I can help you fighting ISIS, as if ISIS is the only threat. You ask the Syrian public, they will tell you ISIS and the regime are the threat. The second point I would like to say before I end my contribution in about 3 minutes. There was something that became very popular around the world out of ISIS' existence and actions in Syria and Iraq, namely that voice which called for protecting the minorities. As we read in the letter of the Muslim scientist, ISIS persecuted and massacred Christians and Yazidis in Iraq, mainly in Iraq and also in Syria. And then there was a voice on the media, especially in the West, and unfortunately by some Christian clerical leaders from Syria, calling for something called the alliance of the minorities. And they started calling for protecting the minorities from ISIS. Now the information on the ground tells us that actually ISIS was massacring everybody, not just the Christians and the Yazidi. So if we want to call for protecting the region from ISIS, we have to call for protecting the region and every human person in the region from ISIS. The amount of Muslims who died by the hand of ISIS may be more than the minorities. Now I'm from the minorities, by the way, I'm Christian. And I do care about my people, don't get me wrong. But I do care about them as part and parcel of the nations and the humans in the region. This is why I'm very critical about the idea of the alliance of minorities. I always tell the Christian clerical leaders whom I meet in conferences on Syria, you are making a horrible mistake. Because first of all, you are minoritizing us. And second, you are, the Arabic word for those minorities who need protection is dimitude. So by calling for protection, you are dimitudizing us, if there's such a word. So in other words, the Christians are making themselves minority, are making themselves dimitude by asking for protection as if they are not citizens, but alien communities happen to exist in that region and they need somebody to take care of them. Now I do understand the existential, emotional level that makes Christians on the public side call for that. But I don't understand it from Christian leaders who are calling for this as a strategy. ISIS is a danger against the entire region and against every human person in it, from every background, from every religion, from every sect. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Awad. And finally, we have Professor Timur Yuskayev. Assistant Professor of Contemporary Islam, co-editor of the Muslim World Journal, co-director of the Islamic Chaplaincy Program at the Hartford Seminary. His upcoming book, Speaking Quran, The Emergence of an American Sacred Text, examines contemporary written and oral interpretations of the Quran. Professor Iskaf.
So you have heard I'm a professor of contemporary Islam. There is also, I need to add that my perspective, the way I teach and the way I study my subjects is mostly anthropological. So if you hear disagreements in our perspectives, it's because our perspectives are different. So when I use words such as state, or caliphate, or others, I define and study them as anthropological categories rather than theological categories. There is nothing more contemporary than the New York Times. I hope you have looked at New York Times today. There is a heart-wrenching article in there by, well, the title of it is, I Cannot Be Forgiven for Abu Ghraib. And it is written by a gentleman who used to torture people at Abu Ghraib. Let me, not so contemporary. Back in 2002, according to Bob Woodward, who wrote this book called Plan of Attack, Secretary of State at the time, Colin Powell, in a private conversation, told President George W. Bush at the time, and the quote, I assume he said it kind of sarcastically, right? If you just read it out, you don't get it. But I think he said it sarcastically. He told President Bush at the time, you are going to be the proud owner of 25 million people. You will own all of their hopes, aspirations, and problems. You will own it all. The reason why they are here, one of the reasons I assume, well, because there are dozens of bloody, horrible conflicts unfolding now around the world as we speak. Most of them we do not notice. This particular conflict is a part of our mediascape, so to say. One of the reasons why it is a part of our mediascape is because we own it. Colin Powell was right. And when he said aspirations, hopes, and problems, we own those. How do we own them? There are a variety of perspectives, varieties of ways of doing it. The way I look at it, just because I study a particular subject, I study Muslim diasporas, which is an anthropological term, in the US and Europe. One of the stories that is widely heard now is about foreign recruits to ISIS, including those from Europe primarily. There have been some individuals who tried to get there from the US, Canada, and other places. I myself am originally from Russia. Apparently there are people who are recruited, individuals. I think the numbers are exaggerated if you actually look at the numbers. But there are individuals there from Muslim regions in Russia who keep going there, including from Crimea, which just became a part of Russia again. So diasporic dimension of this conflict is important. It is important for ISIS for a variety of reasons, and it is important for us, for citizens and other categories of people who reside in these places. Otherwise, why would we care about this distant conflict? Now, there is something that I have noticed in observing this, and this is a basic observation, right? One of the problems with talking about ISIS, or the Islamic State as it has defined itself, is that the very words that we use, right, such as state, they have different meanings in different places and different times, right? So if we are to talk about pre-modern or late antiquity understanding of what a state was. And if you're talking about the state as contemporary human beings in places like Syria or Iraq understand them, that same word may mean quite different things. One of the things that it certainly means is some kind of notion of nationhood and nationalism. One of the things that I think Colin Powell may have meant is that when the US and other allies went to destroy and then build a nation, you cannot build a nation without nationalism. What has transpired, first Iraq, then Syria, states were destabilized in profound ways. Those states were not perfect. They were really brutal. They, however, had a system of instilling and controlling nationalism, right? After that, the grammar of nationalism, the very logic of nationalism remained, but the state control of it has weakened. So this very same logic has been translated into other things. It has been merged with new versions of something that can be called Islamic nationalism. Or in the case of ISAS, Islamic pan-nationalism, so to say. So it appeals to people across the globe who assign to themselves and who are assigned Muslim identities as though being Muslim is a national or ethnic type of identity, right? Being Muslim for many people, it corresponds with some kind of sense of nationalism. Now you translate it into places where let me just point out, because how much do I have? Perfect. So there are a couple of places where you can, if you want to look into this subject further, of course there are people who know it better and trace it better, the region. So you may want to regularly visit the website of Professor Juan Cole, Informed Comment, who writes on Iraq and other subjects. You also may want to look at Joshua Landis's website, Syria Comment. On that website, Syria Comment, today there was a wonderful little op-ed by a professor from Oklahoma University, Loretta Bass, who is the author of a book called African Immigrant Families in Another France. What Dr. Bass observes is that in France, there is a phenomenon commonly known among the young people in France of immigrant background, North African or Sub-Saharan African backgrounds, a phenomenon of feeling French on the inside while being African on the out. She quotes a gentleman who tells her, a young man, who tells her, I am Algerian despite my French papers. I am French despite my Algerian appearance. I was not born in Algeria. I was not brought up in Algeria. I do not have Algerian habits. I am not at home in Algeria. I don't think like an Algerian, but I feel Algerian all the same. What it is imagine you have communities where there are individuals who grow up, they're part of the society, right? They attend public schools and so forth and so on. And yet they're being constantly told that they're different because they're Muslim. Now there are positive ways of doing it, and there are negative ways of doing it. If it is accompanied by discrimination, where to be Muslim means absolutely being fundamentally different and an outsider, and you will never belong to something called the French Republic or this or other republic, that creates some issues, right? So when you have a media phenomenon, and ISIS is a media phenomenon that projects another kind of It's not real national, it's like supranationalism. Unlike real nationalism, it's not tied into an actual state where nationalism is controlled from birth to the death, right? But it offers this kind of strange, vacuous, virtual sense of national belonging, which is it's a complete kind of mirage, right? It can be taken in any way, which partly is the appeal, right? The people on the other side, and those people are few in numbers if you look at them, but they can interpret the message of ISIS in any way they want, because they're not there. They can romanticize it in any way they want, because they're not there. When they go there, realities are quite brutal, right? But there is something in here that is disturbing. Now I'm going to end at this, and hopefully you'll have some questions and answers, and if you want me to elaborate on it, I will. So I have mentioned a few key words. One of them was nationalism. My overall observation is that the real cancer, the real disease, is nationalism.
Thank you, Professor Yaskayev. If you would just give the whole panel a hand. And the way we're going to have questions, because you all have to use the mic, is that if you can put your hand up, and I will point to which person the mic would go to. So Susan will bring you the mic. Are there any questions? Okay, the gentleman here.
I'd like to anyway, I'd like to ask Professor Salam a little more information about that letter, so that I can look online and study it.
Thank you.
It's called an open letter to Baghdadi.
Could you spell that out?
Open letter, Baghdadi, who was the self-proclaimed caliph. Baghdi. Baghdi. Yeah, it's a pretty long letter that goes through each of their ideas systematically and basically disputes everything on a legal basis.
Is it online?
It's online, yeah. And it's signed by about 150 scholars throughout the globe. Yeah.
Any other questions? How about the lady over here, please?
Was the letter delivered to ISIS, and if so, was there any response?
There wasn't a response, but they did their part, yeah. There wasn't a response from ISIS, but they did their responsibility in condemning and disputing these ideas on a theological and a legal basis, because if the ideas are not disputed intellectually, there's the risk of people continuing to believe many of the claims that ISIS is making, and to believe that their actions are somehow justified within the Islamic tradition when it is not in any way, shape, or form.
Thank you. Gentleman over here.
Excuse me, may I comment a bit?
Oh, sure, please, please, sir.
I think we have to also be aware of one thing here. We are not dealing in ISIS with people who are really theologians or intellectuals, not at all. So basically this letter is not going to be answered by them, and the Muslim scientists are not Sorry to say that, not stupid, they know that. But sending the letter to the leader of ISIS was a message to the other Muslim public in the area that the Muslim scholars can respond to what ISIS claimed to be the real Islam. So the message is not really to ISIS, but more to the public.
Professor Scott.
And the other thing, you know, if you study rhetoric, there are varieties of audiences in the rhetorical address. This letter, I don't think is directed at the person who is identified as its primary audience. The primary audience is the secondary, those who will overhear it. So it was posted online widely, partly because ISIS is a physical phenomenon, but also a virtual phenomenon, right? Also, it's available in English, which is a Muslim tongue in places like, you know, the US and other places in Britain and Scandinavia and so forth, right? So the potential, you know, people who are interested in this kind of subject can see a counter opinion, which is very eloquent.
Yeah.
Yes. American-led coalition has two targets. First, to arrest ISIS, and second, to topple down Bashar al-Assad. So do you think this is rational to have both targets, whereas to have one to arrest ISIS, this is difficult. Moreover, to topple down Bashar al-Assad. So this is rational to have both targets. Thank you.
Shall I answer?
Sure, please. Maybe Dr.
First of all, my observation says that the coalition is not really trying to do these two things together. I disagree with that reading, if I may. I think the coalition is trying now to fight ISIS. That's what the coalition says. And by saying to me as a reader and observer, when they say to me, the war against ISIS is going to take a long time, at least 3 years, they are telling me Bashar al-Assad is going to remain in rule for 3 years. So they're not telling me at all that they are getting rid of that regime with ISIS. I think to really get rid of ISIS, not only militaristically, but from the mind of the public, you need to also get rid of the other killer who is competing with ISIS and killing the people. And when people, the public, compare, what they see is that both are killing us. But ISIS is telling us, if you follow me, I don't kill you. Al-Assad is not saying that, he's just killing. Because he said, either me or nobody, no Syria. So I'm just trying to say, strategically speaking, you cannot finish ISIS by military alone. You have to finish also the other counter of ISIS, counter ISIS, to tell the people, I am here to help you get rid of everyone killing you. And that's not what's happening at the moment.
Professor Yuskaya, do you want
I just want to point out something obvious. ISIS is not the only kind of problematic player. I mean, of course, the Assad government is one of them, but there are a whole bunch of other groups that have disturbing practices and disturbing ideologies, and which are sometimes viewed as allies in the effort of ousting Assad. So if the ISIS goes, there is no guarantee that another group will not show up.
No, there are already groups like Jabhat al-Nusra and others, and what complicates matters even more is the fact that for the majority Sunni Syrians, Assad is a Alawite, a Shiite, and therefore, to use the term that Najib does not like to apply to himself, and I agree with Najib actually, but at any rate, in Syria Syria we have a minority rule of a majority which is not happy with, and that complicates things even further. Before Bashar al-Assad, his father came to rule by iron and fire, but Syrian identity and Syrian nationalism is very important. Not all nationalism is bad, Timur. To have an identity and a love for your roots is good if nationalism does not become fascism.
That's not what I mean by
Yeah.
There was a question at the back. The gentleman, the student first, please.
Thank you for the insightful and very necessary discussion. My question is, for instance, there was an open letter about basically putting down everything that ISIS stands for. But as far as what ISIS stands for and is, would you be able to speak more directly on what is so compelling about ISIS and what they're actually using as rhetoric to be able to get people supporting? Because like you said, there are people coming from Europe, and they're trying to get people from America there. So just directly speaking on that.
Professor Yuskaya, do you want to take it from a contemporary perspective?
Yeah, but I also want to bring in other opinions because any kind of appeal is necessarily local and contextual, right? You cannot just appeal to everybody around the globe. So in Syria, if they are to appeal to anybody, they would be appealing in a particular way. In Iraq, it will be different. In Turkey, it will be different. In Chechnya, it will be different. Yeah, right? So, however, the way that it works, one thing that puzzles me is how a conflict that is very local, it used to be a very local conflict in Iraq, right? Which happened once the state of Saddam Hussein was destroyed and a rival nationalism emerged or developed, the Shiite nationalism, right? So Sunni nationalism all of a sudden came to the fore, right? Either way, it was a local conflict expressed through the language of nationalism. Then it somehow migrated and metastasized into Syria. Still a local conflict. How does such a local conflict can have any appeal outside of those particular contexts? Part of what I'm trying to say is that it has the appeal because it plugs into the grammar of kind of nationalist feelings, which some perhaps individuals from diaspora communities have not attached to the countries to which they're supposed to have feelings of nationalism. If somebody does not feel fully French, does not feel fully welcome in France, and is looking for alternatives, and are being constantly told, you're Muslim, therefore you're not French, they don't know anything. They will look for alternatives. Hopefully, in most cases, they will find sound alternatives, right? And it so happens that people who do get involved in this, if you look at the profiles of those people, they happen to be people who are kind of on the outskirts of the Muslim communities, right? They're not people who belong and active in mosques and so forth and so on. Those are people who are more like lonely people who find their community on the internet, who find their nationalism and belonging on the internet, right? And then buy tickets to Turkey and take a bus and so forth.
I think that you want to make a comment and then Dr. Awad.
Yeah, I'll be brief. As far as we know, ISIS began in Iraq in 1999, and it spread to other countries. But in most cases, for instance in Iraq, many of the elements that came to form ISIS were Ba'athis, that is members of the Ba'ath party of Saddam's government, and other Sunnis who were in jail, and they were let out. The same, I think, happened in Syria. The people who formed the core of Syrian ISIS were political prisoners in al-Assad's prisons. And as Najib has already indicated, they formed with Assad's blessing in order for him to say, I am fighting terrorism. So it's a very complicated matter, and then the fact is there are other groups that are like ISIS, and some of them join ISIS, others have not. And people, and I think Timur is right, that a lot of these people who are lonely, who are looking for something, ISIS uses two terms that are very important for the Muslim sentimental mind, and that is the word jihad, struggle, or striving for the good, and the word caliphate. And when they come together, then what the Prophet called the lesser jihad, that is armed struggle, takes over, and the greater jihad, that is jihad against one's own soul and one's own tendencies, is forgotten. Then the problem becomes what we have today in the Muslim world.
Dr. Awad?
If I understood the question, it is like, what makes some Muslims find in ISIS an example of a possibility they believe if it happened it would be good for them in a way. I agree fully with my colleague Timur that this is a very contextual question and one has to discern every context. In Syria, what we hear from the people who come from cities like Raqqa, northern Syria, or Deir Zor, eastern Syria on the border with Iraq, who were living with ISIS. Like people who found ISIS invading their cities and living under ISIS rule. What we hear from them about why they felt ISIS is a voice that makes sense in their situation are maybe the following two reasons. Some of the people would feel ISIS is appealing not because they support its methods or they support ISIS per se, but because they realize, as I said it earlier, if you abide with ISIS rules, yeah, and if you accept how they live, they will let you alive. They will let you live. And for the Syrians who are just praying that tomorrow will be a day for them where they will stay alive, when someone comes and tells them, I'm in control of where you live, and I'm going to let you live if you abide with my Islam. And those people are Muslims, so they would say, he's asking us to abide with what we already believe in. So that will not be a problem for them, because it's life or death. So that's one reason I talked about that. The other one is also as important in my view. There is a deep, and we have in the West really to pay, in the world, to pay attention to it carefully. There's a deep, deep frustration in the Muslim Sunnite Arab world from that seemingly attempt at giving Iran the upper hand in the region. If we deny that, we are not willing to read bravely the situation. Iran is ruling Syria. We know that Qasem Soleimani is the executive leader of Syria 2 years ago, since 2 years ago. He runs things on a daily basis. Now, the people are not blind, are not stupid. There is this part of the sociology and anthropology of the Arab people. Their religiosity matters to them. So there is a deep Sunnite frustration from their feeling that the decision makers around the world are willing to give Iran the upper hand and the upper voice at the expense of the Sunnite world. On the level of the public, this makes them sentimentally long for a Sunnite voice that can stand and say something against the voice which they consider representative of the Iranian one. Not because they agree with the methods, but because it's the only voice for them. That's on the level of the people.
Thank you, Dr. Awad. Dr. Sam.
Yeah, and just to add to that, that voice is then taking verses out of context and applying hadiths that are not contextualized. And so people who, with limited education in Islam, take things literally without the sufficient training that requires to deal with these texts. There's a huge volume and corpus of hadith literature, of scripture, of how these scriptural verses and things are contextualized within their period, within the tafsir, the exegesis of particular verses. And what has happened also in the Muslim world is the dismantling of the educational system. And that has resulted in people studying Islam in a superficial manner, and that as a result have misunderstood a great part of the tradition itself. Whereas for 1400 years, before colonization of the area, before the endowment system was taken apart, you had scholars that made sure that in studying and understanding the tradition, it was done in a way that was humanized through human contact and through contextualizing these sources. So, a little religion can be very dangerous in any tradition. And what these scholars are arguing here is that it's not less religion that is the cure to extremism, but in fact more religion that cures extremism.
Dr. Yuskaf, a quick question and then...
I just want to point out, so one of the dangers of having brief conversations about this conflict is being caught up in the language of Sunni community versus the Shiite community, or Alawite community, or something like that. There is a very simple, basic fact, I think. The Assad government would not be in power had it not been for the fact that the majority of, or a huge number of the Sunnis inside the country support his regime. His military is not exclusively Alawite. Had it been exclusively Alawite, he would be out of power. He has a significant base in the Sunni community as well, right? So it is not sectarian, it's presented quite often as sectarian. It's more complicated than that.
The gentleman in the green jacket.
Thank you very much, and my apologies for missing some of the presentation. On this last point, that ties into a question I have about the globalists. As much as I respect what you're saying about nation states, and I would agree in some macro level that we're entering a post-national period, that doesn't help people in Syria. That doesn't help people in Iraq. And as was just raised up, there are elements of culture and ethnic identity and religion that enter into this, but there's also this political overlay of the Baathists. It seems to transcend that a bit, that has been injected into this at various levels, some into IS itself, some with the Assad regime, and I'm wondering now whether the globalists in fact want IS because they no longer like the concept of a well-balanced state with people with sound religion and good moral values that can do right by people, that they would rather have something like IS. And since the nation states no longer seem to serve their purposes, and just go with people like Baathists to govern as they may.
Go ahead, Dr. Ayyub.
Yes, a very interesting fact is that the Ba'ath ideology, the Ba'ath party, was founded by a Christian thinker from Syria. And Michel Aflaq thought of Ba'ath, which means resurrection, that is the awakening of the Arab nation, meant his ideology for all the Arabs, and he did not oppose the religion, but it is a secular party. Now what the Syrians, for instance, did, because the Ba'ath ruled in Syria and Iraq, what the Syrians did is they evolved something that they call Ba'ath Qatri, what is the national Ba'ath party that was only for Syria. And Syria and Iraq were not actually always on good terms, even though they followed a similar, supposedly, ideology. And Michel Aflaq died a very poor and broken-hearted man in Brazil, because his actually the Ba'ath ideology is quite appealing. And I think that the people who came to form ISIS may not all be very well educated, but they were actually politically quite aware. And what we have, again, is a variety of Islamic extremism that happens to be largely within the majority Sunni community. And I think this seems to be a phenomenon following the period of colonialism and relating to the period in which we now are of neo-colonialism.
Thank you. I think there's a student right next to you.
Good evening. Dr. Ayub, you said a statement that is quite insightful. You said ISIS is not unique, nor is it out of the realm of Islam. And here my question is, what's the problem with saying that ISIS is part of the temporal map of Islam or Islamic history? If there's such a thing to begin with, like in a vacuum, Islamic history. And how can the distinction between Islam, the text, Islam al-Nas, and Islam, the history, Islam al-Tarikh, can help with such a statement on one side? And on the other side, how can the reformulation of the concept of Islamic history, and the question here for Dr. Timur, a reformulation of Islamic history that is not exclusively Islamic, but also, just taken 100 years back, it also includes the encounters of the Islamic world with the West, with colonialism and nationalism here, and also to the war on Iraq, help with saying or understanding, because the issue is if you keep condemning ISIS and you say, by saying that ISIS is not Islamic, then how can you relate it to something that you can understand it? This is the question. Thank you.
Dr. Ayub, do you want to go first?
Yeah, in a way, you answered your own question. That is by indicating how complicated the whole situation is. And I tried in my initial remarks to contextualize ISIS by beginning with the Khawarij, the Kharijites, and without going into details, I meant to say that extremism appeared in every epoch of Islam, and among Muslims, for instance, like the Kharijites, of whom the Prophet is said to have declared that the other Muslims would find their own piety lacking compared to the piety of these Kharijites, yet their piety does not go beyond their mouths. Again, why? Because they killed fellow Muslims and anybody who disagreed with them. Some people like to link ISIS to the Wahhabi movement of Saudi Arabia, I think that may play a role, but it shouldn't be exaggerated. What I meant, the basic point I wanted to make, and let me try to make it again, is that I cannot say to anybody who says, I bear witness that God alone is God and that Muhammad is his messenger, you are not a Muslim. Because that's against the Quran. The Quran says, do not say to one who greets you with the greeting of Islam, Man alqa ilaykum as-salama, you are not a person of faith. I can say that ISIS, their behavior is a deviation both from Islamic law and Islamic history. The way they are dealing with people as we learn from the media. Now, it could be that the media is exaggerating, but there seems to be quite a consensus in the world, and we see it also in video and so on, as they keep beheading people, that ISIS is ruling really with a very brutal and very un-Islamic way. But I cannot deny that they are Muslims, because that has been largely our problem throughout Muslim history. When I give myself the authority to decide who is a Muslim and who is not.
Did you want to add something to it? Dr. Saleh?
Just to add to that, there was an article in The Guardian today called Becoming ISIS, and one of the important things that was mentioned in there was that 37 out of the 50 main leaders of ISIS came out of US prisons in Iraq. And so these were people who came out with a very radicalized perspective due to the political events inside of Iraq after the US occupation of Iraq. And then they used religion in a way to justify their zealotry and their hatred towards the United States, basically.
All right. So your question is tough, right? So there's no answer to that. But therefore, I'm going to use this opportunity to just remind a few things. This conflict is one of the reasons why we're here and we hear about this conflict is because it is not just a local conflict, it is a global contestation, right? So Manjeet mentioned Iran, I will mention Russia, and we are in the United States. It is a contestation between global powers and proxy powers that are allied with those global powers, including powers in the region. No state in the region is uninvolved in this conflict. Every single state, including those whose involvement we do not know, is involved in this conflict, because it is a conflict that is shaping history, just like the conflict in Afghanistan in the 80s shaped history, and we are now living in consequences of that conflict.
Right. Let's have two more questions. Professor Landau first, please.
Thank you very much, all of you. I appreciate the intra-Islamic challenges that you're addressing, and I want, if we can, just to pull back the lens a little bit, which I think Timur was just doing, and looking at the more global as well as the psychological, the universal human psychological developments that have been happening after the demise of the Ottoman Empire and the European imposition of arbitrarily carved out nation states, and followed by strongman rulers, not just in the Middle East or North Africa, in the Balkans, all the way to Africa, Idi Amin. This is a larger phenomenon of security states run by secret police, muhabara, that totally destabilize individual identity and that are based on fear, intimidation, and torture for dissidents. So with what was called, euphemistically and messianically almost, the Arab Spring, all of these autocratic regimes, which were propped up by Western oil money, toppled. And now, out of this chaos comes what the psychoanalysts would call the return of the repressed. So whether you call it tribalism or sectarianism, you have all of these smaller groups trying to assert themselves and acquire control over national resources, right? So here's my fear, that the West will misread this and will see Islamism the way it viewed communism and the way Ho Chi Minh's nationalism was misread under this absurd domino theory, and which led to disastrous American foreign policy. So we don't see things from the ground up. We see things ideologically from a drone. That's the American technological solution, is to see things from way up and impose some kind of ideological fiction on local realities. And how can we educate Americans to see things more accurately?
Yes, Coach, did you have your hand up, or Professor Salam, do you want to go?
One sentence. Start really doubting the media.
One sentence. I don't agree fully with Najib's characterization of the role of Iran in the Arab world. But that's something we will argue about by ourselves.
Over a cup of coffee, ma'am.
Yeah, a cup of coffee would be good.
And I just want to say something that may be provocative. So that warning that General Powell made back in 2002, in the summer 2002, where he said something to the effect, you break it, you own it. And it's something that has been popularly called as a Pottery Barn rule, right? Thomas Friedman supposedly came up with that phrase. So it is this rule of you break it, you own it, is quite often, typically presented as a rule of unintended consequence. Oops, we broke the place. Right? If you look through recent history, please, there are a ton of places that have been, oops, broken. Afghanistan, oops, broken. Central African countries of all places. Guatemala, oops, broken. Nigeria, oops, broken. Something tells me that it is a rule of an intended consequence.
I think there was a lady there who was waiting for a long time, so the last question goes to her.
I was wondering about the panel's opinion about this use of the word, I think it's pronounced Daesh, as an alternative to giving legitimacy to ISIL by using, the word Islamic State, whatever, ISIL, ISIS, whatever. So I wondered what you thought about that as a term that might help to put the true state of ISIS more in, I don't speak Arabic, but I'd like to hear what you say.
Yeah. Go ahead.
A friend of mine actually wrote an article on that for the Boston Globe, and it seems that here is starting to use the term Daesh instead of ISIS. Daesh in Arabic means cutthroats, and that's what they are. And in the Muslim world, nobody refers to them as the Islamic State, and that's what they're referred to as in the Muslim world.
Daesh is an acronym, actually, which means the State of Islam in Iraq and Sham, Syria. And it has a negative connotation. But do you think, Brian, we can ask each other questions, that's okay. Do you think that Daesh kept changing its name because of this, or they began to see themselves in different guises when they talked about themselves as the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, Greater Syria, then in Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, then the Islamic State without calling it anywhere. Is it because they think their caliphate will rule the whole Muslim world, or they want to be recognized wherever they happen to play a dominant role? And they are actually, so far, and it's a question we did not actually talk about, is how do they exist? Who funds them? You know, who trains them? I mean, and we are being told every day that this is a group that may that we may have to fight for a long, long time. The arms industry in Europe and the United States and Russia actually will do well, but the people in the countries where Daesh has power will suffer, and that's the world, unfortunately.
So thank you very much to all of you. You've been a wonderful audience. Your questions and answers were very, very pertinent and relevant. And thank you to the panelists. I would like you to give them one last hand. Thank you very much.